I'm glad to see such a good crowd here today. Good evening. Welcome to the University of Houston. Thanks for coming to tonight's moderated debate, the first in the 2013-2014 Energy Symposium series, Critical Issues in Energy. I'm Dan Wells, Dean of the College of Natural Sciences and Mathematics, and your host for the evening. Through this series, we are taking a closer look at 4 key topics in energy. And through each topic, we're bringing together industry experts to help us gain a better understanding of these complex issues. Tonight's topic is hydraulic fracturing. Is it sustainable? This is a topic we've all read about. We've heard in the news. You can't turn on any media outlet without hearing about hydraulic fracturing. So I'm very excited about this topic tonight. I do want to mention the future topics. This is the first in a series of 4 lectures that we're going to have on the same theme, moderated debates. So please join us for these events as well. With that, I'd like to introduce Dr. Ramanand Krishnamurti to open up the series. Dr. Krishnamurti is the UH Chief Energy Officer and Professor of Chemical and Biomolecular Engineering and Petroleum Engineering in the College of Engineering, and also holds a joint appointment as a Professor of Chemistry in the College of Natural Sciences and Mathematics. The University of Houston has identified energy as one of its key strategic focuses for education, research, and technology. As Chief Energy Officer, Dr. Krishnamurti is leading those efforts, and he has partnered with the College of Natural Science and Mathematics in coordinating and planning the entire Energy Symposium series. Dr. Krishnamurti.
Thank you very much, Dan. Welcome to all of you to the Critical Issues in Energy Symposium series that we are hosting here at the University of Houston. First of all, I want to thank a few people for actually creating this event and making it happen. The first person I want to thank is Mark Smith, the former Dean of the College of Natural Science and Math, whose idea it was to create this series. He came up with the idea. He presented it to the Energy Advisory Board that advises the Chancellor, Renu Khator, about issues in energy, and they loved it. And they loved it to the point where David Ram, who is the head of the Energy Advisory Board and seated right there, he took it as a singular charge to make sure that it happened and happened well. And so when I took over this role as the Chief Energy Officer in February, David and I had a heart-to-heart conversation, and we made clear to each other that this was going to be a very, very high priority for the university to make a mark in the space of energy. And not just be a place where we have sound bites on critical issues, but have thoughtful, well-educated discussions that can really help drive the energy, the issues in energy as being as a focal point in what we do. So, David, thank you so much for all that you've done and for all your encouragement and help as we put this series together. Art Wegline, who's also in the College of Natural Science and Math, along with Dan, have been instrumental in really getting most of the intellectual aspects taken care of, and really my team of people in my part of the world in UH Energy have interfaced great with the College of Natural Science and Math. You probably have seen some of them around here. Taylor Nussbaum, Kathy Major, who's in NSM, and Stephanie Coates have really put this together, and they've been sort of instrumental in making this happen. So much in terms of introductions. I sort of mentioned the three young ladies' names because they're the ones who are going to be collecting these index cards from you later on. And these index cards are not there to sort of doodle and do things, but actually to come up with some nice questions that we can challenge Paul, Krishna, and Scott Anderson with. And the idea was that they're going to collect these throughout the lecture as you have questions. If you can have them come to the edges of your aisles, they'll pick them up, and then we'll get them to Margaret, who will moderate that discussion. So I've sort of given them a part of the story. Margaret is our moderator, and we're so delighted to have her here. Margaret Hill is a partner at Blancrom. She has over 25 years of experience as somebody working in the area of energy and the environment. She leads Blancrom's environmental litigation practice and is the chairperson of Blancrom's Shale Development Industrial Group. And so these are sort of very important parts of what Blankchrome does. And for those who don't know who Blankchrome is a big law firm in the Philadelphia, Washington area. And all of you have heard of the stories about the Marcellus Shale and the issues with the development of the Marcellus Shales. And they've been right front and center with that aspect of it and the consequences of hydraulic fracturing. So she's been, when we had an opportunity to have her here as the moderator, we jumped at it. And so thank you so much for being here and moderating this debate. She also has had experience working in Texas. She was a part of Gulf Oil. She worked as a legal advisor for Gulf Oil, and she also, before that, worked in the Department of Justice as a trial attorney in the Environmental and Natural Resources Division. So she has very wide experience, sort of seen it from all different sides, and we couldn't have found a better person for this task of moderating this debate. Thank you so much, Margaret. So at this point, I'm going to turn over the discussion to Margaret and let her introduce our speakers. And thank you all again for coming out to this wonderful lecture. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Ramana, for those very nice words. I want to say that I'm really delighted to be here. This is a great venue to discuss all the issues that are presenting the country today in terms of oil and gas development. So I think it's a great thing that the university is doing. I want to introduce our two speakers tonight, and I think probably, at least from my perspective, the first topic in this series, hydraulic fracturing, is a great place to start. As was said earlier, it's definitely a topic that generates a lot of controversy. Most people out there do have an opinion one way or the other on it, and I think tonight you will hear a variety of opinions with respect to whether or not hydraulic fracturing is sustainable. So with us this evening, we have our first speaker, who's going to be Paul Krishna. Paul is the Issues Manager. He was Environmental Health and Safety at XTO, which is a subsidiary of ExxonMobil. He's been with ExxonMobil and now XTO for about 25 years. He's originally from the northeastern part of the country, having graduated from the University of Delaware, and then went on to Purdue University to get his graduate degree. And he's done a number of these events and is very much involved in the issues. Scott Anderson is with the Environmental Defense Fund, which is a very large environmental organization. Many of you probably heard of EDF. They've been very actively engaged in oil and gas development issues in connection with hydraulic fracturing. He has been with EDF for just about 10 years now. And previously, Scott was actually on the other side of the issues, maybe not exactly on the other side, but he actually was representing oil and gas owners. He was with the Texas Independent Producers and Royalty Owners Association, and he was with that organization for about 25 years. Now, first we're going to start with Paul, because Paul does have some slides, and he does actually have a great video of hydraulic fracturing. So for those of you who are not familiar with the actual activity or technology, I think this will introduce you to what it's all about.
Thank you, and it's really good to be here at the University of Houston. I think you're off to a tremendous start with this series, and if the interest here level continues, I think you're going to have a great 4 sessions. I wanted to talk a little bit about my background as well. Just as a geologist, what I find in this issue when we deal with hydraulic fracturing, I tend to have more of a technical bent and tend to look at the issues both from a scientific standpoint and then also from the issue standpoint of what that means to the various stakeholders that it affects. I'm going to start off with a quick slideshow just to sort of set the stage. But before I start flipping through them, when I think of the term sustainability and the way ExxonMobil views, we're using the word sustainability in the title, we typically look at it as our primary mission is to provide energy both for the generations that are here today and the generations of the future, and also to generate a return to our shareholder. And so therefore, we follow the sustainability definition that was established by Brundtland, which is that it's a balanced approach between economic development, social development, environmental protection, both for the generations now and not to harm the generations of the future. And so we take a very broad look at that when we're talking about oil and gas, and I see hydraulic fracturing is no different as falling into that mix. A little bit about XTO, ExxonMobil. I use those terms interchangeably. A number of people will tend to know us from one bent or the other. But about 3 years ago, ExxonMobil purchased XTO Energy. And at that time, XTO Energy was the largest gas producer in the United States. In many corners, it might have been the largest gas producer you never heard of. It was very quiet, and if you weren't looking at the onshore development at that time, if you were looking at, say, what some of our companies were looking at, which was LNG imports or large offshore production, there was a good, big revolution going on onshore development in the U.S. So about 3 years ago, we acquired XTO Energy, and we have a team that's moved over from ExxonMobil into XTO that is working to integrate the company, but retain its culture, retain the technical expertise, retain the entrepreneurial spirit. So people know us as XTO, people know us as ExxonMobil. We view it basically interchangeably. As far as the gas production in the United States, and this is looking at 2012 data, so we're the largest gas producer, and the other companies that are, I'd say, in the top 4 or so are Chesapeake, Anadarko, and Devon, and these are the big unconventional gas producers. If we were to look at it from an oil perspective, ExxonMobil XTO would be in about the 3rd position. When I talk about sustainability, and what our company does every year is we provide an energy outlook, and we look out to about 2040. And we look at what are the demographic changes, what are they going to be like, what type of GDP growth are we going to see, what new inputs come into our models. And so what we see right now is that if by 2040, which is where we're looking out to, that there'll be about 9 billion people on this planet. We're about 7 billion right now. So there's going to be a big demand for energy. If you look at it today, there's probably 1 billion people that don't have electricity that want it. So we see a tremendous demand that's going to be out there for energy both now and into the future. The middle panel shows the average growth per year of GDP, and it's divided both in the blue being OECD countries such as the US, Australia, Europe, and the non-OECD, which are typically China, India, and Brazil, and many others. 5/6 of the planet is going to be in that red, and they're going to be on a tremendous growth going through 2040 during that time. And so that leads to, well, how much demand do we have? What's the energy demand going to be by 2040? And if you look at those curves, you would expect them to track, but actually they don't because of the energy efficiency we'll save with the technologies that we have, as well as the utilization of natural gas. And so you see in the OECD countries in the blue, that curve actually starts bending down. And even though the non-OECD countries are growing, they're growing at a slower rate, despite serving even more people and more energy demand. Now, the good news about natural gas is there's a lot of it. Again, from our energy outlook, and this is based on the IEA estimates from 2011, we're looking at about roughly 28,000 trillion cubic feet of gas across the world. And about 45% of that is considered unconventional gas. So you could think about, well, that probably would require some kind of stimulation or hydraulic fracturing to develop. So that is the positive story. And when we look at the global energy mix, oil, the left bars on each one of these indicates where we are today, or roughly 2010. The one on the right is to 2040. Oil still remains a major energy component that's utilized. Gas will actually grow at a very fast rate, almost 65%, and also basically through coal substitution, actually move into the 2nd position. And then coal will be in 3rd. And then there's a number of fast-growing of energy sources, such as solar, wind, biofuels, that are growing at a faster rate, but their base is at a small enough level right now that it doesn't show as high as the other bars. The good news about natural gas, and that I expect we'll be talking about today, both in terms of what it provides to the economy, but also what it provides as far as environmental protections. You can look at any headlines, and it changes almost dramatically from quarter to quarter, but our greenhouse gas emissions, or CO2 equivalent emissions, are down to 1994 levels. I've seen some other headlines about 92 and so on, but through kind of what's going on with regulation in this country, with gas substitution for coal and other factors, the USA is actually reducing its greenhouse gas emissions. And if you think about 1994, that was probably at the beginning of my career with this company, and that's just been a big, long time, and it's amazing that it's made this kind of impact. So now I'm going to show you a quick video. It's a 2-minute video on the actual hydraulic fracturing.
Hydraulic fracturing is a time-tested, proven technology. It's been used in more than 1 million wells worldwide for the past 6 decades. This is how it works. First, once the necessary infrastructure is in place, a drilling rig is assembled and inspected in accordance with the required safety and environmental standards. Only once we are satisfied that all the required standards have been met can drilling begin. When the well is drilled, multiple layers of cement and steel casing are inserted to create an impermeable barrier between the well and the groundwater. The well is drilled vertically until it nears the shale zone. Just prior to the shale zone, the well turns and horizontal drilling begins. The Empire State Building extends 1,453 feet from base to tip. The depth of a well can be over 8 Empire State Buildings. After another cement casing is put in place to ensure maximum system integrity, a perforating device is inserted to create small holes in the casing and the rock. Then, fluids comprised predominantly of water and sand are pumped down into the wellbore, creating tiny hairline fractures. Gas trapped in the shale zone is released within the tiny hairline fractures and safely brought up the wellbore and to the surface. America has vast amounts of natural gas, which can provide a cleaner burning source of energy for more than 100 years. Technology is making it possible to safely and responsibly unlock this energy endowment.
That video it's a public video, so it's available at a website called aboutnaturalgas.com if you want to watch it again. And I think that finishes my opening remarks.
So far, I haven't disagreed with Paul on anything. So a little bit about Environmental Defense Fund first. Environmental Defense Fund, EDF, was founded in 1967 on Long Island, and what brought the organization together was the crusade to ban DDT. At that time, at least what I've been told, is that our informal motto was "Sue the bastards." Somewhere along the line between 1967 and today, our MO changed, and we're now known for working with businesses whenever possible, looking for ways to harness market forces to solve environmental problems. And now on our business card, instead of saying "Sue the bastards," it says "Finding the ways that work." So that's my mantra these days, is finding the ways that work. We do still know how to sue the bastards, and I guess I should admit, I hate to say this, Paul, but one of the guys in the office suggested to me that, I'm sure he was joking, but I never used PowerPoint. He said, "You really ought to use one slide. You ought to speak for 12 minutes and just have a slide of the Exxon Valdez up on the screen." You know, that wouldn't be relevant. That wouldn't be nice. And besides that, I mean, the fact of the matter is, I know Paul well enough to know that there's more things that he and I agree on this subject than that we disagree on. But with the moderator's help, I'm sure we can find an argument or two or three to get into. But for the most part, I think what you're going to hear is more of a discussion of some of the issues. Real briefly, what I want to go over here is EDF's overall view and our overall strategy for oil and gas work. Notice I don't call it hydraulic fracturing work. I'll get to that in a second. But our overall view of what's needed in oil and gas regulation and operations is that we need to get the rules right. And we're primarily focused at the state level for reasons I can talk about later, but to get the rules right with the regulations. Secondly, to get the performance right, and that breaks down into both performance by the regulators, i.e. enforcement, and also performance by industry. You know, spills are already against the law. Spills happen anyway. The industry already knows how to drill perfect wells like the one we just saw in the video, but not all wells are perfect. So it's not just a matter of getting the rules right, we also need to get the execution, the performance right, both in industry and in the regulatory agencies. And then finally is a matter of basically setting the record straight, finding out what the facts are and getting the facts around to people, giving credit where credit is due, and giving blame where blame is due for people who don't do what they should do. So that's one way of looking at our program. And then another way to look at it is to talk about the issues themselves. And I've got 5 buckets of issues that I'll briefly summarize. But before that, I wanted to say a word about fracking and also a word about sustainability. When I use the word fracking, I usually don't use the word fracking because it's just become too loaded of a word for my taste, so I don't usually use it. But I have done a fair amount of research on it, and it's pretty amazing the kind of things that people say have been caused by fracking. You probably all know that it can cause cows' tails to fall off. I've also read that it can cause STDs, and I've read that it can cause impotence. So I'm here to tell you that, frankly, I can believe that maybe it causes cow tails to fall off, or that it might cause STDs or impotence, but I'm reasonably sure it doesn't cause both STDs and impotence. Another thing that Paul and I agree on is that when we do use the word fracking, we tend to not use it with a K. I spell it without a K. And if somebody wants to ask a question about that later, we can say why, but I spell it without a K. And I try to use hydraulic fracturing in its technical sense. Hydraulic fracturing is not a synonym for drilling. It's not a synonym for oil and gas development. It is a specific process that takes place after a well is drilled and before a well is put on production. That's when fracking happens. So as the video showed, fracking is a part of the completion process. It's a type of stimulation, and the base fluid, usually water, and the proppant and chemicals, which I noticed didn't make it into Paul's video, but chemicals are injected at high pressure to create the fractures, and that's what fracking is, without a K. So another thing I would agree with Paul on is that to date, that's an important qualifier, to date, hydraulic fracturing has not been shown to have polluted drinking water. There are other kinds of water, but to date, hydraulic fracturing in this technical sense I just talked about has not been proven to have polluted drinking water anywhere through the fractures themselves. Now, that's not the same thing as saying that oil and gas development hadn't polluted water. It's not the same thing as saying that frac chemicals haven't gotten loose in the environment. They have. They've gotten loose several times from spills of chemicals before being injected. They've gotten loose dozens of times, but when well bores blow out and the chemicals are spewed into the air and fall back down. And they've gotten loose in the environment hundreds and more likely thousands of times through spills of the flowback fluid that a certain amount of the chemicals that go down come back up. And there are a lot of problems in this industry with surface spills. So I'll go in later, perhaps, if there are questions about sort of the relative risk to the environment of surface spills and things that happen downhole. But to conclude this little talk about hydraulic fracturing, I would say, so is it risk-free? No, absolutely not. Just because that it hasn't polluted drinking water yet doesn't mean that it can't. I'm convinced eventually it will. Then again, when it finally does, that's going to be a 1 in a million proposition. It does not routinely pollute drinking water through the fractures themselves if you define fracking in the technical sense. But there are risks. For example, although wells can be 8 times as deep as a Empire State Building, the shallowest frac in Texas, known to the Railroad Commission, is 967 feet. That's only a little bit more than half of an Empire State Building. And the narrowest distance in Texas, known to the Railroad Commission, between the base of protected water and a frac zone is 67 feet. In the Yates Field in West Texas, which is a field known to have caverns in it. And yet, even in the Yates Field, there's been no proven cases of fracking having polluted drinking water. So it does have risks, but relative to other things that go on in this industry, the risks of fracking in the technical sense are relatively small. Okay, sustainability. Is this sustainable? My first answer is, of course not. That's using the word sustainable in the sense of basically eternal. I mean, fossil fuels are eventually going to run out, and if the definition of sustainability is permanent, no. At some point, we're going to stop hydraulic fracturing. Can hydraulic fracturing go on for a long, long time? Absolutely. Even after 60 years of developing this technology in the shale plays, people are still only recovering right now something like 6 or 7% of the oil or gas in place. The technology is still in its infancy, really, as far as developments, and so I think that we'll see, assuming economic assumptions and policy assumptions, it's from a physical viewpoint, sure, the oil and gas industry could go on for quite some time in the future. But does sustainability mean being able to do it safely, or as Paul put it, in a balanced way? And my answer to that is, yeah, pretty much, if we get the rules right, if we get the performance right, and if we really pay attention to the facts. So that leads me to my 5 buckets of issues, and then I'll be done. The way we categorize the issues that we're working on, first of all, is transparency. People need to know what the facts are. And the preeminent example so far of a political issue under this banner of transparency is the mandatory disclosure of frac chemicals. The very first state to require that was Wyoming in the middle of 2010. Arkansas became the second state at the beginning of 2011. Later in 2011, Texas became the third state. And then just since 2011, we've gone from that situation to 21 states having now passed requirements for the public disclosure of what chemicals are used in fracking, with 6 or 7 other states actively considering such requirements. And I'll give a little nod to Exxon and XTO. The Texas legislation, which really was the biggest domino that kicked off all that, would probably not have become law if Exxon here hadn't helped a little bit. So that's transparency. But other examples of transparency, as an issue, probably the biggest one that's shaping up on the horizon right now is transparency related to enforcement activities at agencies. So it's not necessarily something that has to do with chemicals. Okay, so that's transparency. Second bucket would be well integrity. Fracking, in that technical narrow sense, is one of the sub-issues under the heading of well integrity. But for the most part, when we talk about well integrity, we're talking about what can go wrong on the well that we saw in the video. And for the most part, what can go wrong is if they don't get the cement job right, or they don't get the casing right, or they don't do a good job of monitoring and controlling the wellhead pressures. You can ask BP about certain of those things. So that's well integrity. One of the risks of fracking is that if not done right and watched right, it is possible that one can damage what would otherwise be a good well by not designing the well and the frack job in a way that go together right. Okay, so that's well integrity. Third bucket of issues would be air issues, which divides neatly into, at least in our mind, it divides neatly into greenhouse gas emissions. That would be methane, which is much more potent greenhouse gas than CO2, and into conventional pollutants, which can be toxic and can cause smog and stuff like that. Fourth bucket, and it's a really big one, is water and waste management. I said that I would get a little bit into the relative risks between on the surface environmental risk and downhole. The best study I know of on that question focused on about 2 decades of data in Ohio and Texas. And over that approximately 20 years, stirring those 2 states together, there were about 400 confirmed instances of groundwater pollution known to have been caused by oil and gas exploration and production activity. There's probably a lot more than that. It's just 400 that are known, in the enforcement records. And of those approximately 400 examples, 70% of them were caused by surface spills, defined broadly to include everything from literally spilling something to things seeping out of a tank or seeping out of a pit. About 20% of those were caused by old legacy orphan unplugged wells, and about 10% of those incidents were caused by a wide variety of well integrity problems, but mostly casing cement and poor pressure management. Brings me to the final bucket, and then I'll be done, which would be probably the very hardest one to deal with, and also the one that, although it doesn't tend to get listed first by environmental groups because it's not really pollution, if you talk to normal, regular people, this is the one that they would probably list first, and that is impacts of infrastructure. You can't have a well without a pad. You can't have a bunch of wells without some amount of drilling density. And so what we're talking about here, and you can't have them without roads and without pipelines. So what we're talking about here is, in an urban context, you're talking about roads, congestion, safety, light, noise, proximity to the schoolyard, proximity to the church. In a more rural area, again, it's roads, it's habitat fragmentation, it's negative impacts on view sheds and that sort of thing. So that's a tough one because you can't have an industry without infrastructure. You in theory might be able to solve the pollution issues, but infrastructure impacts can never totally go away. All you can really do is minimize it and optimize it and balance it, to go back to Paul's definition of sustainability. Thanks.
We'll take some questions from the audience after I ask a few questions first. So feel free to get your index cards passed around, and they'll be brought up front, and we will address those. My first question I'd like to ask to Paul, I heard what Scott said about sustainability in terms of hydraulic fracturing not being considered sustainability. And I guess it depends on, of course, your definition of sustainability. So I'm going to put it to you. Do you think hydraulic fracturing is sustainable? And the one thing I want to emphasize here is we've been talking about hydraulic fracturing, but of course, one of the things that you've seen in the video, and I think if you've just been listening, is when we're talking about hydraulic fracturing, we're not just talking about hydraulic fracturing, but we're talking about hydraulic fracturing when combined with horizontal drilling, which is what is really happening now in the field. So that's really part of what I'm asking here. Do you?
Yeah, I mean, I'd be repeating myself, but we definitely view that it's a blend of economic growth. It's about social development, and it's about environmental protection. I guess someday down the road, probably I'll be gone. I think many of the people in this room will be gone. There'll be some future where there's no hydrocarbons. But right now, if you look at that chart where it shows 28,000 trillion cubic feet of gas that we know of right now, there seems to be a very long future about that. So I guess my view of sustainability is more practical about what do we need to do now to really address kind of what we have in the next 30 years. But I agree with you, at some point it runs out. But I think from our view and from a company view, how do you have to operate in the future, we view it the way I've just described.
What are you doing in terms of water resources? And by that I mean XTO, if you just want to talk about industry generally. I think that's a really important part of whether or not it is sustainable. For example, we know on the East Coast there seems to be plenty of water. It's very available. However, I know that recently there was some commentary provided about Texas that there may not be water for future generations, given the amount of water that's being used for oil and gas development. How do you address that issue?
I think one of the first things we did is we wanted to understand what our footprint was in the different areas. And so we looked at the different areas, whether it was Marcellus or Haynesville or Fayetteville, to see, okay, where are we operating? Where are we operating in areas that might have scarce water? In every place, if you were to look at, okay, who are the large consumers? Or actually, what is the oil and gas consumption in that particular basin? Oil and gas typically comes out about 1%. It's very low. Your main users are municipalities, irrigation, agriculture. That's really the dominant force. Now, clearly, with more people on this planet, we're going to need to be using our water wisely. So we are doing research, and we are looking at different places what we can do. One study we did recently was published in SPE, I think at the beginning of this year, is we tried to use produced water in a hydraulic fracturing type concept in New Mexico. And we did that with Halliburton. And we kind of went through that process to see how that would work. And we did a number of tests to see where it was actually successful. But like anything, we're looking at what our footprint is and what we can use as far as substituting. So where we can do something, we'll try to do it. But again, I guess in a larger context, if you're only a 1% user, I had another NGO, to be named, not to be named, tell me that maybe it would be more valuable not so much to affect your operation, but to do something that helps agriculture. Because if a big chunk of water is being used there, maybe more efficiency in that regard would actually go a longer way.
Scott, ask you, what do you think should be done in terms of the water resources issue? I mean, I know there's different technologies being looked at, but of course are not, at least as I understand it, very successful today. I mean, we're talking about using produced water. We're talking about, gels being used in fracturing. So how does EDF look at this?
Yeah, so 1% water use was sort of in Texas at least, was traditionally the amount of the state's fresh water that people thought of as being used by the oil and gas industry. And I believe in this state that we've now gotten up over 2% of the state's water use. I don't have a good enough crystal ball to really predict the future, but let's say it's 2 on its way to 2.5 or 3. Still not as much at all as agriculture or probably even golf courses, but that is starting to get to be, you know, a fair amount of water. Okay, that's one point. The second point is that the statewide number or a basin-wide number really is, even if true, it can be misleading because water needs are local. If you go to a particular aquifer or a particular county or a particular ranch, you know, in South Texas, you can get much, much higher percentages, more like 70%, 90%. On the average, you're down to 3%, 2%, 1%. But where it really matters, it can be extremely water intensive. Okay, so what do we think should be done? One of our fellow environmental groups last year proposed mandating recycling of frac flowback fluid in order to solve water consumption problems. We opposed that. We are certainly, you know, like recycling as well as the next guy, but here's what recycling of produced water would mean in this industry. Currently, the industry produces, you'll know better, I believe it's billions of barrels of salty, chemical-laden water per year in this country. And most of that goes down deep disposal wells, which I like to call God's disposal wells, because they usually do work. And that's a great thing to do with this nasty stuff, is to re-inject it 9,000 feet beneath the ground. So that's kind of the status quo. The future, which is rapidly emerging, of maximizing the recycling of this water means that instead of taking that bad stuff and putting it down a deep disposal well as quickly as possible, that now we're talking about storing as much as we possibly can store of this salty, chemically laden substance in volumes that are so big that people are now throwing up new types of tanks, bigger tanks than anyone was using 2 or 3 years ago. I've heard of tanks as big as 70,000 barrels. I've heard of pits to facilitate recycling of as big as 200,000 barrels. Massive amounts of this stuff, this waste, is being stored, and then it has to be transported. Pipelines leak, and in fact, the traditional surface pipelines that people have used for fresh water in this business is aluminum irrigation pipe, which leaks at every joint. Now, they've hopefully all stopped using that, or maybe never even started for this salty water, but it raises regulatory questions and technical questions. How should these kind of pits be designed? What about the tanks? Inspections, maintenance, engineering requirements. Same deal for the pipelines. And then the other little bump for recycling of produced water is that it does need to be treated. So that can either mean taking stuff out of it or putting stuff into it. When you take something out of it, now you've got what I call a novel residual waste stream, which guess what? It still needs to go somewhere, and it's probably more concentrated than the stuff you started with. So now we have this new waste stream, and we've got clever engineers in the industry thinking of new things to do with those waste streams. Some people are solidifying them and sending them not to the disposal wells, but to landfills that weren't really designed with this particular waste in mind. And we have other creative people talking about using it for road base or turning it into kitchen countertops and stuff like that. So yeah, recycling is a great way to solve water conservation issues, but let's be careful.
Okay. Paul, I can't let that go, what I heard about the nasty water, chemical laden. So I know you have to have a response for that.
Well, the produced water that Scott's talking about is very saline. I mean, it's much more saline than what you have ocean water. You think of that as a salty water. This is a lot more saline. You're producing this is coming up from depths of thousands and thousands of feet, and you're producing it with the hydrocarbons. So I don't know about the chemical laden. We do introduce chemicals into it through the process, but that sort of sounds like there's like a layer of film laying on top of it. It has been introduced to chemicals, so I'm sure there's some residue with it. But I actually agree with Scott as I look at it. The recycling sounds good when you hear about it and you hear it in terms of the water scarcity. But our experience also is now you are taking this stuff, which is it's very corrosive, when you have this kind of very saline produced water. And now you're saying, well, let's build an infrastructure above the land and manage it that way. And it does solve one problem, which is you now have something to use for your hydraulic fracturing or, in West Texas, it may be for reservoir maintenance or for water flooding. But it causes a whole bunch of other issues where you got to manage this above ground, and it becomes a lot more complicated and a lot more, as Scott said, a lot more thinking has to be done about how you go about doing it. Mm-hmm. So it's an issue I think we're all struggling with, because you would like to use it in some way, and it can be shown to be used, but to do it in a very large-scale way it's challenging.
Scott, I know that EDF has joined the Center for Sustainable Shale Development, and you and I chatted about that a little bit. I haven't really heard much about what's going on, and maybe that I might have missed something, but since the original introduction of the center, and I know that the desire was to try to come up with some standards an industry might be able to follow, and then subsequent certification by those who are interested in having certification. What's happening with that? Is the premise for CSSD that the states are not doing a good job? Or is the premise that perhaps you can set some standards and states may adopt those, they may not adopt those? I'm just trying to see whether or not you think there's a hole in terms of what states are doing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so no, the Center for Sustainable Shale Development is not intended as a substitute for regulation, and it's really also not intended to map out any kind of future course for regulations. I mentioned earlier that our view of the world is that in addition to getting the rules right, we need to get performance right, including improvements in corporate performance. So that's what the CSSD is about, is stimulating improvements in corporate performance. So what the CSSD, the premise of it came out of two things. One was an advisory committee that Secretary Chu at DOE put together that EDF's President Fred Krupp served on. And they called for regional centers of excellence, I think the phrase was. Also, the National Petroleum Council report of a couple of years ago called for regional centers like this. So what CSSD does is it's a multi-stakeholder group. We've got NGOs on the board, we have companies on the board, we have some other folks on the board. And the companies, because I like to give credit where credit's due, are Shell and Chevron and Consul and EQT. So those four companies came together with EDF and others, and we hammered out 15 voluntary standards. The principle is that each of these 15 standards is supposed to be stronger than any of the current regulations in any of the states that have Marcellus Shale or Utica. And our idea is that if we ever catch the regulations getting ahead of our standards, and we'll amend our standards to get ahead of the regulations. And then also these companies have agreed to third-party audits to determine which of the standards they're meeting. And so these are, I guess it goes without saying, standards meant to improve their, or to lessen their environmental footprint. So the standards were adopted earlier this year. We announced the existence of the organization earlier this year. We said that we hoped that audits would begin by the fall of this year. They haven't. And more recently, we've said that we hope that audits will begin before the end of the year, which maybe they will. If not by the end of the year, certainly very early next year. So where we are right now, frankly, is putting the finishing touches on some guidance manuals for the auditors.
Now, EDF, as I understand, is the only environmental NGO that's part of now?
No,
No?
we also have Clean Air Task Force.
Okay.
And we have a group called GASP. Which,
Yeah, I've heard of them.
Okay. And then we have Penn, is it Penn Future or Penn? And then
Okay.
Penn Future.
Yeah. Because at least some of the articles I read, and I don't know if you have a view on this, was EDF took a fairly big hit by, I think, some of the other environmental organizations about being part of the CSSD.
Yeah, 60 of our colleagues held a press conference in Washington to denounce us for this.
Right. Okay. Okay. Now, XTO is not a member of CSSD, so I'd like to hear from you, Paul, as to why you haven't been part of that effort, if you think that the states are already doing a job in terms of regulations, or?
Yeah, I think,
What-
you know,
what do you think?
when we looked at the 15 standards, and we probably meet 90% of it, and then the rest of it is sort of future forward. You know, there's some year targets for 2014 and so on. But that, for us, that wasn't the issue. Our issue is we really believe that the arbiter, the decider, the one that gives the public confidence is the state regulator. And so what we didn't want to see, or I guess what we didn't like about CSSD is this auditing feature that basically was, in our view, and I know it wasn't intended this way, but in our view, that it undercut the state regulator because we view them as the one that gives the public confidence about what are the right standards, what is the level playing field. And we felt that the Marcellus states, you know, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, Ohio, and others are doing a very good job at what they're doing and looking at the regulations, going through stronger reviews to make sure they've got the best regulations. The other item is that, you know, there are lots of things in the Marcellus Shale. There's the Appalachian Shale Responsible Guidelines, which about 11 companies have signed on to follow. There's the Marcellus Shale Coalition Responsible Practices, which represents 83% of producers and production in the Marcellus Shale. And we're very active in that area, developing responsible practices that way and employing them in our businesses. So for a number of those reasons, it really came down to the state regulator. And you know, I'll give a plug. I was speaking to someone earlier about this, but we really view with the amount of development that's still to come, and particularly in various parts of the U.S., that we are going to need more state regulators to do state regulations, state enforcement, and so on. And so we contributed $1 million along with General Electric to 3 universities. It was Penn State, Colorado School of Mines, and University of Texas to develop a curriculum that would really train the regulators of the future. And so we were really happy to see that this was announced probably about 1.5 years ago. We're really proud that the 3 universities pooled their funds and actually had their first course in August in Denver, Colorado, which included a course curriculum and then also a visit to the field where they actually saw a hydraulic fracturing completion and flowback operation.
I'm going to turn to some of the audience questions now, just so that I don't cheat you out of trying to get your views heard. Now, this is an interesting question because I actually hear from clients, because we represent, obviously, the blank Rome oil and gas companies and service providers in the industry. This is for Scott. This has to do with transparency. The question is, how can we have full transparency, but at the same time protect intellectual property? If I develop a new chemical that works better, or if you're combining chemicals, obviously, with fracturing fluid, I don't want my competitors to steal my intellectual property.
Right. Yeah, so I think I heard the adjective full transparency there, which is not what I said. I said transparency. So the disclosure rules in all of these states, with the possible pending exception of Alaska, but at least in all 21 of the states that currently have chemical disclosure requirements, they each include trade secret protection provisions, and we support that. In fact, I can make the argument from an environmental policy viewpoint that protection of the intellectual property is important to foster innovation in the arena of greener chemistry. And in fact, some of the service companies have persuaded me that we can expect in the not too distant future to probably see an uptick in trade secret protections as people bring greener chemicals to market. So our basic approach to the trade secret issue has been to balance it. We want to make sure the definitions are right, that the exception doesn't swallow the rule, that there's good enforcement mechanisms to keep people honest and that sort of thing. And there are some bugs in the system. So one company that can remain nameless, but I predicted to me that they would be claiming 5% of their chemicals as trade secrets, and another big service company predicted to me that they'd be claiming 15%. And that company, at least for 1 month in Texas last year, came in right on the money, 15.3%. But the company that predicted 5% to me was somewhere like north of 20%, and we're not quite sure why. So it's really too early to give definitive discussion of the statistics. They're not really all together yet, but it is looking like there's more trade secrets being claimed than maybe there should be. But the basic idea that we ought to protect true trade secrets is something that EDF supports, as long as the bar is very high.
Good response. My question to you as a follow-up there is, I know that EPA received a petition from one of your colleague NGOs, Earth Justice, I know, sent them a petition along with some other groups, and I think that was probably about maybe 2 years ago, actually this November, asking for further disclosure of information under the Toxic Substances Control Act. As I reviewed that petition in terms of requiring more disclosure, what it seemed to suggest was that they would have to disclose, the industry would, chemical mixtures and substances, which goes to the heart of the trade secret issue, which is if you're disclosing the exact nature of that chemical mixture, you're giving away your trade secret. So would you be supporting EPA, or I'm hearing that you would not support EPA in that effort? You believe in trade secret protection.
Yeah, so we were part of that petition,
Okay, you were.
and it's been a long time since, like you say, it's been 2 years, and the difference between that and the state based chemical disclosure is that petition was aimed at the manufacturers of the chemicals and
Right.
those who mix it. That's how
Right.
the mixture kind of thing got in there, as opposed to the operators. The 21 states that have disclosure requirements are asking the operators to get information from the service companies
Right.
who are at the tail end of the food chain in the chemical industry. This petition under TSCA was asking EPA to use its authorities under TSCA to do some investigating up at the front end of that chain. And what I'm afraid I don't remember is what the trade secret aspects of TSCA are.
Well, there is a trade secret provision. We don't have to get the legal side of that, but it all goes to the whole issue of chemical mixtures. Okay, this question I'm going to ask for Paul, and I think this is something that I think is a good question, because I think for those in the industry, they all recognize that at the outset of this whole, debate over hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling, that industry really did not do a good job in terms of getting across its message about how it can be done safely to protect the environment. So the question, the way it's written here is, Why isn't the oil and gas industry better able to educate the public that natural gas is more of a clean fuel than it is a fossil fuel and influence public policy?
Because it's both, I guess. It's both the way we think of it. I definitely think in the early days we could have done a lot of things better. I have a colleague that says the first thing he would have done is not called it hydraulic fracturing, because that's sort of in the lightning rod. If you ever want your report read or press release read, put the word fracking in it, and it'll generate definitely hits. I think we can always do better. I think one of the ways, I'll just tell you from my perspective, I think just a company going out and talking about what they do, I think the general public wants to see some objectivity to it. They know you are what you're about, and they want to see, okay, what do others think? And so I think one of the things I've done since I've come to XTO is try to get involved in some key studies with some key academics to solve some scientific problems or issues that'll bring some new information to that inform the public and inform things. And so I'll give one example, and Scott's organization and my organization actually work together on this, and it's what we're referred to as the University of Texas Environmental Defense Fund Direct Methane Measurement Study. And if you haven't, just Google it, you'll find it. And it was led by Dr. Allen. He's a very renowned chemical engineering professor at UT, and involved about 9 oil and gas companies as well. And if in this space, one of the big issues is around methane, about how much methane is actually leaking from the different parts of the natural gas cycle. Going from the production phase to gas, gas processing and distribution, transmission, vehicles, and all the way out to the customer. We don't know what that is. There are lots of papers written about it, and they all have assumptions. And so really the last 2 years we've been in this cycle of I'll use these assumptions and come out with my number and hit a headline that says gas is safe. And then the very next day there'll be somebody else uses different assumptions and says we're melting the planet. And so we've been sort of stuck in this cycle, and I have to give a lot of credit to UT and to EDF, because it was a lot of their vision to let's quantify, let's actually directly measure, go out there and measure the flow back, measure pneumatics, measure unloadings, and let's see what the numbers say. And they did this at 190 well sites. They went to 4 different regions in the country, and the results are coming out, and you may have read the headline. The headlines are the overall headline kind of comes out and says it matches what the EPA estimates numbers are right now. And there were some really good learnings in there. I mean, one of the good learnings, and I think we knew, given that the NSPS rule was coming, people were starting to capture their flow back. You heard Scott talk about flow back. They were starting to capture it so you wouldn't have those emissions coming out ahead of the rule. So what this study showed, there was basically a 97% reduction compared to what the EPA number was. But at the same time, as we went through it, pneumatics, which is, I'm getting to learn about pneumatics, and maybe there's some people really excited about pneumatics, but there's like high bleeds and low bleeds and intermittent bleeds, and then there's even more categories around that. And what they're out in our different operations, and they control valves. And they're run off of natural gas because we're not always connected to the electrical grid. Those actually tend to be significantly higher. So even within this data, we started looking at it and seeing there's really opportunities here to get smarter about what we do and how do we control these emissions. And then there were also some data that we just didn't collect enough data in that study. And so one of the things we're doing now is we're working with EDF and Dr. Allen again, and adding a few more companies to do a phase 2, which will just focus on those areas where we feel like we need more understanding or we need to get more information.
Okay. How do you resolve the problem like New York? I mean, talking about just trying to get your message out and trying to make sure that people understand what this technology is all about. What's going wrong in New York?
I'm from New Jersey, so to be fair. What's gone wrong with New York? I guess what I would say is, we're following the legislative process, that's been put before us. We provided all the information. I think, just like this UT study, within 24 hours, it is around the world, right? So, it's, everybody sees what that is. I really think we've done what we can. It's in other hands to make a decision on what they want to do. I was really encouraged today when I saw the news that Hillary Clinton was speaking in upstate New York and said some very positive things about the natural gas supply that we have, about surpassing Russia this year as far as being the biggest gas producer. And that definitely, it wasn't so much about energy, it was more about sort of what the ramifications are about energy security and foreign implications. So I was very pleased to see that.
Okay, there's a couple questions here on casing. I'll read one of them. How often do casings fail, and at what failure rate does new regulation make sense? I'll leave it to either one of you if you want.
Yeah, I don't think the assumption of the question seems to be that the only time you change regulations is if you get a statistical measure of failure rate over X. That lies behind the question, and that's really not the way regulation either works or, in my opinion, should work. The precautionary principle, I guess, is worth mentioning here. But when you talk to state regulators, what they're looking for is what are the risks, and there are other ways besides a statistical study of the failure rate is 0.00067 or is it 0.1. There are other ways that people with expertise in regulating this or any other business can go about deciding whether something needs to be tinkered with. I mentioned earlier that so far hydraulic fracturing has not been shown to have polluted any drinking water through the fractures themselves. As recently as the last crop of railroad commissioners, just 2 years ago, we had railroad commissioners making talks saying that it was, quote, impossible for fracking to pollute groundwater. That's not true. It's pretty damn close to impossible if the fracking is happening 9,000 feet below. But if it's a 967-foot frac, or if it's 67 feet or even 670 feet below the base of the protected water, there is a real risk, okay? So the Railroad Commission, in its current wisdom, no longer is saying that it's impossible. What they're saying is that they have identified what they call a handful of fields in the state, a few dozen. This is a state with many thousands of fields. Several dozen of those fields do present enough risk that the Railroad Commission has seen fit to pass a new rule in May of this year to require operators in these limited situations to both submit more data about the geology and to also take special precautions in the way the wells are drilled and completed. So there's an example of what I would consider a very progressive, forward-thinking regulation. They didn't wait for something bad to happen. They saw a situation where the handwriting was on the wall, and they've acted in advance in a reasonable way. But to get to the part of the question about how often casings fail, very rarely. George King with Apache is soon going to be publishing a paper where he tries to answer that to several decimal places, and I would refer you to his paper when it comes out. But not too often. George, it probably happens about 8 or 9 times more often than George would say, but that's still way less than 1%, way less than 1/10%.
Okay, we have time for one more question. This is a fairly thoughtful question here, directed to you, Paul. Using LNG for majority oil usage like transportation would require massive infrastructure change. Why not spend that money for renewables like electric instead of using LNG? Both will cost money, but one is more sustainable.
Okay. I guess going back to,
Hold that front in case you
oh
want
yeah,
to
that's a long one. They're correct. I mean, as far as, when we look at liquefaction, it's a very expensive proposition to big capital projects that are out there to be developed. Our company, I should say, has an application in with DOE to do that as well. What I would say, though, is if you go back to the chart I showed, as far as the energy demand needed and the population, we're going to need all of that. So it's not, to me, it's not a, oh, let's spend it all in renewables and not spend it on natural gas or vice versa. I think we're going to need all those energy sources. The issue with LNG right now is you're starting to see the whole gas market is becoming a global market. And so we see it's a good opportunity there for us, but it's also, I guess, to me, what LNG does is it means a lot of jobs, both here in the U.S., and it's also going to be bringing kind of some energy security to this country, which also will you're starting to see like a lot of the chemical plants, you're starting to see steel plants coming in Ohio. So to me, this sort of completes the natural gas system. And so I wouldn't say it either or. I'd see it as, to me, it's a very needed action right now.
Can I edit my last answer? So George talks about 0.000 something failure rate, and I said that it'd be some multiple of that, but still well below 0.1%. What I had in mind right there was failures of well integrity that actually end up polluting the water. There are other definitions of failure of cement jobs, for example, that do give you a higher failure rate, but it might be better to call this imperfect wells as opposed to polluting wells. And Yoko Ono had an ad in the New York Times where she said that I think 5% of wells leak. And the journal that she had in mind is an article written by Schlumberger, and what that and other literature really says is not that the wells leak to the environment, but that's approximately the percentage of wells that develop what's called sustained casing pressure, which means that there is a leak, but it's an internal leak in the well. And we saw the multiple barriers, cement, steel, cement, steel, cement, steel. And so sustained casing pressure basically means that some of those, but not all of those, barriers failed. And so the well is developing pressure in parts of the well where it shouldn't. So about 5% of wells, and a lot more than 5% offshore, about 5% of onshore wells do develop those problems. Those are wells that I would say have an increased risk of polluting the environment, but that's not the same thing as saying that 5% of the wells pollute the environment.
Thank you for that clarification. The only thing I'm going to ask is I hope you've told Yoko Ono that.
I need her phone number.
I want to thank one time again Margaret Hill, Paul Krishna, Scott Anderson for being here tonight. A very lively discussion, and we have some parting gifts. Margaret, you have a little.
Oh, thank you.
For you.
Thank you very much.
See you next time.